yet another lesson in web development. In today's lesson, we are going to focus on PHP operators as well as conditional logic. Let's have a look at what's in store for today's lesson. Now, today's lesson is as follows. First, we'll start exploring some PHP operators, including logical operators, arithmetic operators, and so on. Next, we'll move on to working with conditional logic or conditional statements. And this refers to if-else statements as well as the switch statement. And then we'll wrap things up with a practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's dive right in and start unpacking our very first topic, PHP operators. First of all, what exactly are operators? Well, operators are used to perform operations on variables and values. PHP divides the operators into various groups. Let's take a look at the different operator types. Now, there are several different operator types. There is arithmetic operators, there are assignment operators, there are also comparison operators as well as logical operators. Let's distinguish between how they differ. Let's start off by looking at arithmetic operators. The PHP arithmetic operator is used with numeric values to perform common arithmetical operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and so on. And here we have a very basic and simple example of creating two variables x and y with the value 20 and 10 respectively. We then echo out this variable, and this is what our output looks like. So here we've performed addition by adding x to y, thus we get the result of 30. Now here is a very comprehensive list of the different arithmetic operators, and this can be found at w3schools.com, which is a brilliant resource if you actually want to play around with the different arithmetic operators. Now, I'm not going to dive into every single one of them as we go along, but I wanted to make this list visible to you in the event that you like to pause and have a look at what each one does. You'll notice that we have addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and so on. And this holds true for all the other operators, where I will be making the different lists available. Excellent. Now let's move on to the assignment operator. The PHP assignment operator is used with numeric values to write a value to a variable, otherwise known as assigning a variable. We've seen this quite a bit through a couple of our examples where we've actually assigned a value to a variable. In this very simple example, we have a variable called x and we are assigning a value of hello world. We do so by using a single equal sign. This is how we assign a value. And much like before, here is a list of all the assignment operators. Now each one has its own description, so I do suggest maybe having a look at how they differ from one another. And next up, we have the comparison operators. The PHP comparison operators are used to compare two values, such as a number or a string. And in our example over here, we've got a couple of values to work with. Now, all we are doing is we're just comparing two values to get a true or false value at the end of the day. So at the top over here, we've got 5 different variables, num1 up until num5. Notice that num5 has a value of 30, but this is in quotation marks. And the reason for this is because this is actually a string and not an integer. And this is where we actually echo var dump every single value. So the best way to think about this is that when we use the double equal sign, we are testing to see if num1 is equal to num2. If we have a look at the variables we created at the top, num1 is equal to 10, where num2 is equal to 20. Therefore, this will return false. That's one thing to keep in mind when it comes to comparison operators. You are always trying to return either a true or a false value. And this is what the output would look like for the rest of them. Let's have a look at the second one, where we call echo var dump on num1 and num3. So the question we are posing here is we are actually asking, is num1 less than num3? So if we have a look at our variables, num1 is 10 and num3 is 15. So therefore, this will return true. Why? Because num1 is actually less than num3. And much like before, here is a list of the comparison operators from W3 Schools. So if you'd like to, take a moment, pause the video over here, and have a look at some of these examples. And finally, we also have logical operators. The logical operators are used to combine conditional statements. This is used often when we want to use switch statements or loop statements, for example. And here is an example. This one is going to be slightly tricky. In our first example over here, we have an if statement. So we've got two variables, num1. We've got another variable, num2, with a value of 10 and 3 respectively. And in our if statement, we are actually asking, If num1 is equal to 10 and num2 is equal to 3, then echo hello world. And this is what the output would look like. So this evaluates to true because our AND logical operator, remember the operator here, the logical operator here is the AND statement or the AND keyword. So for this statement to default to true, both conditions must be met. Num1 must be equal to 10 and num2 must be equal to 3. And we know this is the case because at the top where we created our variables, this is exactly the case. So therefore, this defaults to true and hello world is printed. Let's have a look at another example. In this example, we are using the OR keyword. Okay, so this is what the output looks like, where we get a value of at least one condition is true. How this is different from the previous example is that instead of using the AND keyword, the OR keyword expects that at least one of the conditions must be true. That is to say, if num1 is greater than 10, do something. Or if that is false and this one is true, which is if num2 is less than or equal to 8, then print at least one condition is true. And this defaults to true, thus the statement is successfully printed. And this is the list for all logical operators. Finally, this brings us to the end of all operators. So again, if you do want to take a moment, pause the video over here and have a look at the results or the descriptions for these operators, then feel free to do so. Wonderful. Now let's move on to the next topic for today, which is the use of conditional statements. So first of all, what exactly are conditional statements? Conditional statements are used to perform different actions based on different conditions. Very often you want to write code, you want to perform different actions for different conditions. You can use conditional statements to achieve this. Now, generally speaking, there are 4 different types of conditional statements. We have the if statement, we have the else statement, we have the else if, and then finally we have the switch statement. Let's have a look at this in greater detail. Now, the if statement is fairly simple to understand. This essentially just executes some code if a condition is true. We saw this in an early example when we were working with operators. And here is some pseudocode to better understand how the if statement works. So we start off by saying if, we then supply the condition that we want to be met in parentheses, and then we open a curly brace and we pass in some code that we want to execute if the condition is true, and then we close off that curly brace. Very, very easy to understand, right? And next we have the else statement, which executes some code if a condition is true and another code if the condition is false. So the best way to think about it is like this. Let's have a look at some pseudocode. Now, we've got an if condition, and we are essentially saying that if this condition is true, then execute this code. Else, if the condition is not true, if this condition is not met and it defaults to false, then run whatever is in the else block of code. So the idea here, again, in summary, is that if one condition is not true, move to the next block and test for something else and then run this code. Now, in the event that you have multiple conditions, you tend to use the else if statement. So this executes different codes for more than 2 conditions. So let's take a look at an example. Now, we've got an if condition, and if this condition is not met, it's going to evaluate the next statement. And then if that condition under the else if block is true, then it's going to run that code. Else, if none of these conditions are going to met, it's going to default to the block of code with else, and it will execute that code instead. One thing to note about the else if statement is that if you have several else ifs, it's going to run through them consecutively in a linear fashion until it finds a condition that is met. Again, if that condition is not met, it's going to default to the else statement. Now, lastly, we have the switch statement. Now, the switch statement is not something you'll see very often, but it can be used, and it is quite powerful. If you want to select one of many blocks of code to be executed, use the switch statement. The switch statement is used to avoid long blocks of code that you would otherwise find in if, else, and else statement code blocks. And here is an example. Now, in this example, we kick off by stating switch. With the keyword switch, we then pass in a parameter of n, and then we open our curly brace and we provide the first case. So the first case says that if n is equal to label 1, then execute this piece of code and then break out. Otherwise, if that is not the case and n is equal to label 2, then execute that block of code, and so on and so on. Pretty much like an if-else statement. The difference here is we also have a default block of code which serves much the same purpose as an else statement. So as you can see, you would tend to use a switch statement, and I would say, this is my opinion actually, that when you have a certain amount of known condition and outcomes, that tends to be the real reason why you would use a switch statement. Wonderful. Now let's take everything that we just learned and let's start coding. Now for today's session, I thought I'd keep it quite nimble, but yet at the same time, I want to make this fun. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine the use of operators and if and else statements as well as associative arrays. So hang in there because this one might be a bit tricky, but I think you'd find some value in today's practical demonstration. Now, first things first, always ensure that your XAMPP control panel is active and running. That is to say your Apache server and MySQL database. Again, not so much your SQL database, but you really want to ensure that your Apache server is running. Great. So to get started, I'm simply just going to save this file. So I will say save as. Under my htdocs, under C drive XAMPP, htdocs, I'm going to create a script called l5.php. I'll save this and I can open up with my PHP tags. For this demonstration, I'm not necessarily going to be using any sort of HTML code because again, I want to keep it light, nimble, and simple. So first things first, I'm going to create a salaries array. So this one's going to be called salaries. And this is equal to an array. Let's actually just remove this, an array. And in this array, we are going to have the value Peter. Because we are using an associative array, it's quite important that we use strings as our indexes. Then I'll use my fat arrow. And because I'm going to be working with numerics and operators over here, I need to make sure that I'm using numerics and not a $sign in terms of salaries, okay? Because that would be a string. So my next index is going to be Ben, and again, fat arrow. And Ben earns something like $37,000. And then lastly, I'm going to have Joe, and Joe earns something like 43,000. Is that 43,000? That's good. Yeah, perfect. So we've got 20,000 that Peter earns. We've got Ben earning 37,000 and we have Joe earning 43,000. I'll just close this off, hop onto a new line, and I'm going to create my first if statement. So again, because I'm working with conditional logic, in this parentheses over here, I need to specify the condition that I want to be satisfied or met. And in this case, I'm going to go with if salaries at the Ben index is greater than the salaries for the Peter index. And again, I'm going to take a moment to explain what's going on over here. Then do something. But I don't want it to be this simple. I also want to compare Ben's salary to Joe's salary for this condition. And then what I'll do is I'll use the AND operator. Okay? And then I'll say, again, salaries. Also, if Ben earns a lot more than Joe as well, then this condition is satisfied. Okay, so if Ben, and then I'll call salaries one more time over here, and in here I will pass in Joe, and then that should be it. So let's evaluate the statement. So if Ben salary is more than Peter's salary and Ben's salary is more than Joe's salary, then do something over here. So here I need to enter the code that I want to be executed if this condition is satisfied. So let's say something simple like echo Ben earns the highest salary, and then we'll keep it as that. Now I'm going to use an else if statement as well. So if this condition is not satisfied, move over to the next and evaluate the next statement. So I'll say else if salaries for Joe is, let's just get this correct, Joe is greater than the salary of Peter, let's just get this right, is greater than the salary of Peter, and because I'm using an operator here, remember I'm testing for two conditions that need to be satisfied with my else if, and I'll say and the salaries for Joe is greater than the salary of Ben. So salaries for Ben, then do this instead. Okay, so this is the other condition that's going to be run if the first condition is not met. Then I will say Joe echo Joe earns the highest salary. And then lastly, I'll just have some sort of else condition here. That will be the default condition should none of the first two be met. And this one will simply just say something like Peter echo Peter, let's just add our quotation marks, Peter earns the lowest salary. So let's run through our code. I'll put a line over here just to make sure everything is clean. Also add my semicolons, and here we go. So we've got an array of salaries, and in this array of salaries we have Peter who earns 20,000, Ben who earns 37,000, and Joe who earns 43,000. To access these values over here, we need to use the keys associated with them. In this case, it's the name of each employee or individual. So if the salaries array, if Ben earns more than Peter, this is the more than sign, or greater than sign. If Ben earns more than Peter and he earns more than Joe, then Ben obviously earns the highest salary. Likewise, if Joe earns more than Peter and Joe earns more than Ben, then Joe earns the highest salary. Otherwise, Peter earns the lowest salary, and we can actually see that is the case with 20,000 over here. So let's save this, cross our fingers, and hope our code works just fine. So I'm going to local host l5.php. Run this, and we can see that Joe indeed earns the highest salary. And we can actually validate this because we can see Joe earns 43, and this is the highest out of all three employees. Now, what happens if I change this over here and I made this something like 30,000? Then, of course, the values are going to change. So we can expect Ben to earn the highest salary in this case. And you'll see the value or the output now changes because we are satisfying the second condition over here and no longer the first condition. And this is essentially how we can use if, else, and else statements in a really dynamic and powerful way. So you can really start to apply your thinking in terms of how can we use this in an actual web application or website, which is something we're going to do towards the end, okay, when we actually do our single major project. So I really hope this was a very informative session. In our next couple of sessions, we are going to start working with loops as well as functions and more complex things in PHP. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in our next session. Cheers.